In 1611, the scholars at Westminster translated the Sixth Commandment with the words, "You shall not kill." In the King James English at the time, that word had a very specific meaning: the unjust and premeditated violence leading to a loss of life. Our modern English translations all render the commandment with the words, "You shall not murder." But is a Christian ever permitted to take a life? I'm Adam, and this is After the Fact. Christian thinkers have spent a lot of time pondering when it's permissible for a follower of Jesus to take a life, to engage in violence or warfare. From Ambrose to Augustine, later Aquinas, we've distilled these thoughts into what we call the just war theory. Now, the just war theory is meant to guide governments and nations in declaring wars and engaging in conflict, but I think there's some principles that we can learn from this theory to apply to how we live our lives and the conflicts that we find ourselves in. Just wars have to be fought for just reasons, meaning they need to be legitimately declared by a legal authority. They need to be likely to succeed. They need to be wars of last resort, and this is really important. A just war is only just when it's fought when all other diplomatic and economic options have been exhausted. A just war also has to take place for a just cause. It has to be in defense of innocent lives or one's own nation. And so it's not permissible to go to war just to punish someone or to take something that a nation desires or even to take back stolen property. A just war needs to be a war of last recourse and of self-defense or the defense of others or the prevention of some really terrible evil. During warfare, actions taken during war need to be just. There needs to be a distinction between combatants and civilians and medical staff. There needs to be proportionality. You know, if you blow up my tank, I can't blow up your city. There needs to be necessity. There needs to be fair treatment of prisoners of war. There needs to be a Latin phrase that we say, no means malum in se, meaning you can't do inherently evil things just because you're at war. The fact that you're at war doesn't mean that it's suddenly permissible to steal or to murder or to rape or to engage in any sort of other wicked acts just because you are at war. These principles can govern our lives and the conflicts that we find ourselves in. When it comes to us, we may find ourselves in situations where we need to defend ourselves, to defend the lives of those we love. And according to just war theory, it is entirely permissible for a Christian even to take a life in self-defense or in the defense of their loved ones. So long as a life is at risk, it is permissible to take a life. When you have no other option, when you've attempted to de-escalate and the other person won't back down, it is permissible to take a life in defense. I would point out that it is permissible, but it is not necessary, and it's not necessarily commanded, although I think there probably is at least some strong urgency to take a life in defense of others. But there may be some virtue in a willingness to lay down one's own life rather than taking another life. There's an entire branch of thought called Christian pacifism that argues that Christians should embody the forgiving love of Jesus, who willingly died for even his enemies. I personally don't subscribe to that philosophy, but I can see the appeal in it, and I think there's something that we can learn from it. Regardless of where you sit on that spectrum, we must be sober when we think about taking another life. We should not think about it flippantly. I've heard too many jokes of maybe dads on a prom night or someone in a moment of distress. We can be very flippant about taking a life, and we ought not to be. We ought to remember that Jesus commanded us to love our enemies, that when evil is done to us, we retaliate with good and with kindness, that we pray for our enemies, even turning the other cheek towards them. We should take this seriously, and we should not speak of taking a life in a flippant or joking way. We need to remember that God is the giver and the sustainer of life. And so we need to be very careful before we take it upon ourselves to take a life away from anyone. We have to be careful too in a culture that is in many ways inundated with violence. And I love a good war movie and a video game just as much as the next guy. But we are surrounded by violence in our culture. We are surrounded by a very low view of human life and a willingness to treat other people as pawns, we need to remember that life is sacred, a gift given by God, and it is not for us to determine when a life ends. If we find ourselves, and I pray I never do and you never do, if we find ourselves in a situation where we are forced to take a life in defense of ourselves or others, we should do that with a clear conscience, but we should be careful. We should be serious and sober when we consider these things and remember the God that we serve, the value that He places on all human lives. We should remember, no matter how evil or wicked we deem someone else to be, we too are wicked and evil people deserving of death, redeemed by the life and the loving sacrifice of Jesus who laid down His life for us. And so let's love our enemies with that same motivation.